Binyamin the Mystic and his friend Wolfe. The main reason why people stopped paying any attention to Binyamin was because just about this time he had become a crony of a man who had suddenly appeared in Lubavitch. No one thought of taking any notice of this newcomer, for what was he after all but a simple cobbler, and a poor man at that? Wolfe was the cobbler's name. He came with his wife, he said, from a small town in Woolen. He gave no reason for their coming to Lubavitch, and no one was interested enough to inquire. What did it matter to anyone anyway what had brought them to Lubavitch? He couldn't expect much of a living there, but this apparently didn't worry Wolfe. This Wolfe in no way distinguished himself. He became a member of the Chevra Tehillim and, together with other work people, used to come regularly very early in the morning to the Beis HaMedrash to recite Tehillim before the morning service. He also became a member of a society called Poalei Tzedek that came together to study Mishnayos and Ein Yaakov. Wolfe used to sit at the end of the table where the members of Poalei Tzedek had their lesson and listen. No one was sure that the cobbler grasped and understood the meaning of the lesson. The cobbler certainly had a good heart and good intentions, but were these sufficient reasons for making a fuss of this simple man? And so, no fuss was made of him. From time to time, this Wolfe had a habit of disappearing from Lubavitch. He was seen to leave his house with a bundle on his shoulders, which surely contained not much more than his talis, tefillin, a bit of lunch which his wife had wrapped up for him, and his cobbler's tools. Wolfe did not show himself in Lubavitch for several weeks, and then, when on his return anyone asked him where he had been, he used to say that he had been wandering about from village to village, patching and mending the villagers' boots, shoes, or sandals, even here and there reaching some nobleman's mansion and making new boots for the nobility. Now it was with this cobbler Wolfe that Binyamin had suddenly become so friendly. Binyamin even used to leave Lubavitch at the very same time as Wolfe, and return at the same time as he. In short, it appeared that they accompanied each other in their wanderings in the surrounding villages. For, after all, they were not business rivals or competitors. Binyamin traded in various kinds of merchandise, while Wolfe was occupied in his capacity as a cobbler. When two people become so thick and do not move an inch without each other, it is obvious that one is no better than the other. Anyone could see that Wolfe was nothing more than a very ordinary, though honest, cobbler, and so Binyamin could hardly be considered in any way on a higher plane. A year or so had passed since the affair of the robbers, when there appeared in Lubavitch a then famous personality. This was Rabbi Betzalel Uri of Polotsk, who was known to be a great mystic with wonderful powers. On arrival in Lubavitch, he greatly astonished the local Jewish inhabitants by inquiring, with obvious respect, after Binyamin the peddler. "What is the meaning, Rabbi, of your respectful manner regarding Binyamin?" the people asked in bewilderment. To which the visitor replied, "Seemingly you do not know that Rabbi Binyamin is a mystic, and that by his mystical powers he overcame the robbers." The people listened, astounded. They would have never occurred to them. Had they heard this from anyone other than from such a great tzaddik as Rabbi Betzalel Uri of Polotsk, they would not have believed it. But now, of course, there could be no room for doubt about the matter. But where was Binyamin now? A search was made for him in the town. Then it was remembered that it was already some weeks since he had left Lubavitch, and, as always, at the same time as Wolfe the cobbler had gone away. Was it really possible, then, that there was some connection between these two? That their simultaneous disappearances and their friendship for each other had some special significance? Really, the people could see no other way than to conclude that Wolfe the cobbler must also be a mystic, seeing how closely he and Rabbi Binyamin were befriended together. But Rabbi Betzalel Uri had only talked of Rabbi Binyamin, and not of Wolfe. Rabbi Betzalel Uri had sought the peddler, and not the cobbler. Anyway, neither was at present in Lubavitch, and nobody, not even their wives, knew exactly when they would return. Rabbi Betzalel Uri must have had a special mission for Binyamin, judging by his anxiety to find him, which he made no attempt to disguise. Rabbi Betzalel Uri, seeing no point in waiting in Lubavitch for Binyamin's indefinite return, left the town in search of him. All Lubavitch was now talking of the mystic and wonder-worker, Rabbi Binyamin. Now it was clearly seen that his victory over the robbers was indeed accomplished by his supernatural powers. Now they were all ready to acclaim him and offer him their respect and hero worship. But where had Binyamin disappeared to? No one knew. Binyamin, meanwhile, had been wandering from town to town and from village to village, arriving finally at Dabra Mizl, where no one knew him and where he had no need to announce his identity. But once, in a Beis Medrash there, he happened to overhear some fellow Jews discussing him and his wonders, and was greatly disturbed. He could have attained great fame and honor, and been acknowledged as a miracle worker, but this he on no account desired. He wished to remain unnoticed and continue with his life of wandering, unknown and unrecognized. What worried Binyamin the most was the fact that he would need to return to Lubavitch, where everyone knew him. He could no longer remain in the background. He would no longer have any peace, as people would come to him with requests from all sides. Above all, they would give him too much honor. Obviously, he could not avoid going to Lubavitch, as his wife was there, and all her household belongings. So he returned to Lubavitch with a very heavy heart, like a guilty man caught red-handed. Now, it was because of Binyamin's troubled mind, and let it be said that the anxieties of the righteous man are not overlooked on high, or through some other cause. In Lubavitch, something dreadful happened soon after Binyamin's return. A great fire broke out in the town, swallowing up all the houses and buildings in flames. Binyamin's house was also among them. The only Beis Medrash which Lubavitch possessed was likewise destroyed. In all this great catastrophe which had befallen the inhabitants, Binyamin was naturally enough forgotten. And even afterwards, when the last glowing logs of the burnt-out houses were extinguished, and the bewildered and stricken victims recovered from the shock and set themselves to putting a roof over their heads, no particular attention was paid to Binyamin. All the homeless had to get to work rebuilding their houses. There were forests enough at hand, and they only necessitated their going to the forest, cutting down trees, bringing back the logs for building their homes. The Jews living in Lubavitch at that time were a hard-working lot of people. Each could quite expertly handle an axe and saw. Those who could not afford to employ laborers for the job did it themselves. So the forests echoed with the blows of axes and the voices of the woodcutters. Logs were quickly brought from the forest, and soon houses were again standing in the streets of Lubavitch. Binyamin also began the rebuilding of his house. He was now an old man. He had no children to help him in the task, so he engaged workers. While all the people were busy building their houses, he observed that Binyamin seemed to be erecting a rather large building. What was the meaning of it, they wondered? Did Binyamin intend to replace his small burnt-out cottage with such an imposing dwelling? They shrugged their shoulders. They dared not ask Binyamin, and he himself told them nothing. But as the building came nearer completion, the people began to doubt whether Binyamin was in fact building a house for himself. Soon the mystery was cleared. It was, after all, not a house for himself, but a house of God. Binyamin had built a Beis HaMedrash. At last it had dawned upon the minds of the people what had occurred. They had all been so concerned with the erection of their own homes that they had forgotten the necessity of erecting the Beis HaMedrash. This they probably would have seen to after they were all comfortably rehoused. Not so Binyamin. He gave prior place to the building of a house of prayer. Thus the people were again reminded of his righteousness. They decided to call the Beis HaMedrash Binyamin's house of prayer. The people now remembered all that Rabbi Betzalel Uri of Polotsk had told of him, and began talking about it with much enthusiasm. Binyamin tried to deny everything categorically. I am nothing more than a plain peddler. I am no mystic, he maintained. And as if to convince them anew of his humble station, he was more friendly than ever with all the workers in the town, and especially with Wolfe the cobbler, who always gave the impression of not even being able to understand the meaning of the daily prayers. In truth, Wolfe the cobbler too was a mystic, and the friendship between him and Binyamin was for very lofty purposes. No one, however, knew about this, and could not possibly find out, because the only occasions on which they devoted themselves to the study of Torah together was during their absences from Lubavitch, when they could hide themselves in the surrounding forests, which were so ideal for solitude. Wolfe the cobbler was also childless, like Binyamin. During the plague of cholera which had raged in Lubavitch, as well as in nearby towns, when people had been struck down like flies, Wolfe's wife too had fallen victim. Wolfe, still considered by the local inhabitants as a simple worker, had gotten married again to a widow, the daughter of a tailor in Lubavitch. Binyamin, meanwhile, became older and weaker. His legs refused to carry him. He could no more go off on his wanderings as before, nor could he visit the villages on his peddling rounds. His wife, too, had become enfeebled in her old age. They now needed someone to look after them in their home. And so they took in a certain man named Tzvi Aryeh and his wife Leah Brina, a young couple who had no children as yet. Tzvi Aryeh had been earning his living by working in a mill, turning the millstones. He was a simple but God-fearing Jew who lived by the toil of his hands. It is not known whether Tzvi Aryeh was also a mystic or whether Binyamin chose him only for his simplicity and piety. The fact is that Binyamin not only took the young couple in to look after himself and his wife, but he at the same time made Tzvi Aryeh their heir. Before Binyamin died, he sent for the Chevra Kadisha and instructed them as to his burial. He also directed them to reserve a place beside his grave for his wife. He then willed over his house, garden, and all his possessions to Tzvi Aryeh and his wife Leah Brina. He made the condition, though, that they should always keep their house open to wayfarers and make them welcome. They should also take in orphans and bring them up. Binyamin requested of his heirs that, should they be blessed with a son and daughter, they should name them Binyamin and Sarah after himself and his wife. When Binyamin had finished with the burial board and Tzvi Aryeh and his wife, he called in Wolfe the cobbler, who remained with him until the moment of his death. Wolfe stayed for several hours at the deathbed of his dying friend, but what secrets they revealed to each other in the last moments of Binyamin's life on earth were never known. Binyamin's burial, at his own request before passing, was a simple one, and no obituaries were held. A month later, his wife Sarah died and was buried by the side of her husband according to his expressed wish. Tzvi Aryeh and his wife took over the inheritance and carried out all the instructions of Binyamin. Their house was open to all, and they took in and brought up orphans as if they were their own children. Meanwhile, something happened to Wolfe the cobbler. 2 years after he had married his second wife, a traveler passing through Lubavitch saw Wolfe and told everyone in great excitement, "Don't you know who he is? He is Rabbi Wolfe the Iloi, the world-famous scholar of Lutsk. He disappeared years ago with his wife, the daughter of the Gaon Rabbi Yitzchak Gershon, the Rav of Lutsk, and nobody knew where they had got to. Now at last, the people of Lubavitch discovered that this same Wolfe the cobbler was a scholar in disguise, and that he had for years led a secret life. Now it was understood, too, why Binyamin and he had been such close friends. Excitement ran high in Lubavitch. Wolfe could now have had honor and greatness thrust upon him. He would also have had the opportunity of giving up his work of cobbling, but this he would not hear of. He wished to continue his way of life, and if this would prove impossible in Lubavitch, where his secret was now known, then he would again disappear. The way of life he had chosen for himself did not lead to riches and honor, nor had he any intention of using his Torah knowledge as a spade to dig with. He wished to support himself by the labor of his own hands. For him, the maxim, "by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread," had a positive meaning. He did not intend to stay among people who knew that he was not a simple working man. For this reason, he had to leave the town. This time, however, it did not seem so simple. His first wife had been satisfied to share his life of exile and poverty, because she was no less great a personality than he, and was prepared to make equal sacrifices. But his second wife was just an ordinary woman, the daughter of a tailor, the widow of a worker. He did not know how she would act now that she had learned that her husband was not a simple cobbler, but a celebrated scholar. And so Wolfe submitted to her the choice of the two following suggestions. Either she would follow him wherever he would go, or she could obtain a divorce from him. On no account would he or could he stay in Lubavitch. His wife did not want a divorce. She agreed to accompany him in his new exile, and in the course of a couple of days, husband and wife disappeared from Lubavitch. For Wolfe the cobbler and his wife, there now commenced a long exile. They wandered from town to town, supporting themselves by cobbling, a job Wolfe carried on with great keenness, for it meant for him much more than a means of earning a modest living, or as a shield behind which to hide his righteousness and learning. Wolfe found in his work his contentment and idealism in life. Especially did it satisfy his desire to be among workers and simple folk whom he loved with all the fervor of his soul. Cobbling also gave him an opportunity of doing good to people, particularly the poor. Any kind of clothes may do to wear, but footwear must be whole to withstand the cold and snow in winter and the rainy days during the year. Wolfe used to charge the lowest possible prices for his work, firstly because he didn't look for a comfortable living, but only desired the barest minimum of requirements for himself and his wife. Secondly, by charging so little, it enabled the very poor people to have new shoes made, or at least their old ones repaired. Wolfe's wanderings went on for some time, until he reached a village in Wallen, not far from Lukács, where he settled down and made his permanent home. Permanent until he had to leave the place, as was the case when he had to leave Lubavitch. In this village, Wolfe had at first found the contentment he had been looking for since he had left Lubavitch. He was able to lead a quiet, unassuming life without it occurring to anyone that he was a great man in disguise. Wolfe had won a good name for himself among Jews and non-Jews alike, but solely on account of his honesty and conscientiousness in his work. In addition, he was liked for his quiet manner and for never gossiping about people. He had no quarrel with anyone, and as the saying goes, he wouldn't hurt a fly. In truth, Wolfe spoke very little altogether and was considered a silent fellow. People ascribed this to his simplicity as well as to his goodness. The villagers used to call him by the nickname Wolfke Dobry, the Good Wolf. Now, things might have gone on this way, nobody knowing that this quiet man was a great personality and genius, had not something occurred which compelled Wolfe again to pick up and depart. There lived in this village a Catholic priest who had got it into his head that he must and would be able to convert Jews to Christianity. At first, the priest began with soft words and a friendly manner. Every time there was a public holiday, he called together all the inhabitants, Jews as well as non-Jews, and addressed the assembly from a platform in the marketplace. He told them that if the Jews would only adopt the Christian faith and assimilate with the Christians, they would be saved, and together with the Christians would constitute a happy community. All this talk made a great impression on the listeners, especially the Christians, who now really made an effort to show friendship for the Jews. The Jews on their part felt more secure, but as regards the priest's admonition that Jews and Christians should assimilate and become one nation, this had no effect whatsoever. The Jews stuck to their religion and the Christians to theirs, for as long as the priest confined his advice only to friendship between Jews and non-Jews, no one was disturbed. The non-Jews felt they must follow the priest's clearly defined injunction to treat the Jews in the same way as their own people. This was certainly to the advantage of the Jews, and they appreciated it accordingly. It did not take very long, however, before the Jews saw that the priest's fine words were but a preparation. It soon became clear that all this talk of friendship led to his open request that the Jews submit to conversion. The priest began openly to rant against the Jewish faith and proved that Christianity was the only true religion, and precisely as represented by the Catholic Church. The priest even tried to show his learning by quoting passages from the Bible, which he translated in such a way as to show that even the Old Testament recognized Christianity. Learned Jews know what to answer such arguments. Famous Jewish leaders throughout the ages have had to deal with such so-called proofs submitted by missionaries, and frustrated them completely. In this village in Wallen, however, there were unfortunately seen to be no Jew among them capable of replying convincingly to the priest. They were all ordinary people for whom the proofs of the smooth-tongued priest were entirely beyond the power of the argument. So these poor Jews were indeed in a quandary. The priest became more and more pressing in his challenge. He now openly invited the Jews to either repudiate his proofs, which he had taken from the Bible, or else give up their Jewish faith and come over to Christianity. The priest, seeing that none of the Jews attempted to come forward to say anything, became exceedingly proud of himself, feeling that he had certainly beaten the Jews, even if he had not convinced them. He expected to have a big hall, hoping that a great number of Jews would submit to conversion. Once, just before a Christian festival in the summer, the priest assembled all Jews and non-Jews in the marketplace and addressed them from the platform in his usual manner. But this time the priest spoke more sharply against the Jewish religion and put to the Jews the direct demand that they should embrace Christianity. He made fun of their customs and their faith, trying to show with his customary insolence that the truth could be found only in Catholicism. "Can anyone reply to my arguments?" asked the priest, looking around, confident that there was no Jew present who could reply. But suddenly someone stepped forward from among the gathered Jews, saying in a clear-cut voice that he was ready to answer the priest. Everyone in the crowd turned around to see who this man could possibly be. And to their great astonishment, it was none other than Wolfe the cobbler, Wolfe as he was called by the Christians. The man whom most people had never heard open his mouth, so that many wondered if he had the faculty of speech at all. What was the idea of his coming forward? The people asked each other, their eyes popping out of their heads in wonder. The priest, too, was very interested. "Good, Wolfe," he called out. "Do you wish to say something? Come up here onto the platform. Let us all hear what you have to say." The priest was obviously certain that this very Wolfe could help pin the Jews down, and they would not be able to get out of his clutches. With assured steps, Wolfe stepped onto the platform and began to speak. To the amazement of all present, they heard language from which they had never believed could come from him. He spoke in Polish, a fluent, clear Polish, just like a real Pole. The biggest surprise he gave to the listeners, however, was on account of what he said. He started refuting the priest's arguments one after another and brought counter-arguments which made what the priest said appear absolutely ridiculous. The cobbler quoted passage after passage from the Bible in Hebrew, quickly and fluently translating them in Polish. The most amazing part of it all was that everyone understood him clearly and easily, and could not but see that he was in the right. He showed that the priest did not know what he was talking about, and had not only misquoted from the Bible, but had mistranslated or misunderstood his quotations. Now the priest was indeed silenced. He was no match for Wolfe. The argument was now ended, everyone saying that the cobbler had emerged the victor over the priest. The Jews were full of joy. They felt that Wolfe had saved them from a great danger. Even the non-Jews could not help wondering about the sudden revelation of the silent, apparently unlearned Wolfe. The priest dared not insult the Jews any longer, and ceased his public utterances in the marketplace. Thus was Wolfe discovered to be a mystic. His own actions had brought about this revelation, but the urgent need of upholding the sanctity of God's name had left him no alternative. After that, however, he did not feel like remaining in the village where all the inhabitants, Jews and non-Jews, would undoubtedly give him the honor they would now consider due to him, and he would certainly have to give up his cobbling. This he was emphatically determined not to do. He had fulfilled his mission in this place. He could now leave. This had happened in midsummer, before harvesting time. At the beginning of Elul, it was realized that Wolfe and his wife had disappeared. A new period of exile began for him. He was to wander anew through towns and villages, carrying on undisturbed with his job of cobbling, where no one suspected that he was anything other than an ordinary person, with no higher ambition than to spend his time with his equals and earn a very modest living justly and honestly. Back in the village he had left, everyone put up a search for Wolfe. They did not want to lose him, but they found no trace of him whatever. Everybody was very grieved about it. The only exception, naturally, was the priest, who rejoiced greatly. He was now rid of one who had him helplessly pinned to the wall. Now he could start afresh, unhampered on his self-appointed task of trying to convert the Jews. The priest again began his sermons in the marketplace. Again he brought out his old proofs, why Jews should embrace Christianity. The Jews of the village listened to him in sorrow and in fear. They were in sorrow because Wolfe was no longer there to shatter the priest's arguments, and were in fear because they saw all the danger of the priest becoming more determined in his efforts, and even trying compulsory methods. The situation became aggravated since the priest had obtained the services of the son of the local squire to assist him in his missionary work. The young assistant had a fairly good education, but was something of a fanatic. He supported the priest wholeheartedly in his efforts to draw the Jews into the net of conversion. He made a practice of attending the meeting in the marketplace, and also joined the priest in preaching to them. This young nobleman tried to show his theological knowledge in an attempt to convince his Jewish audience that they ought to go over to Christianity, At the same time, he missed no opportunity of threatening them with all kinds of persecution if they persisted in their being obstinate in the matter. The Jews felt terribly downhearted and depressed, and could think of no way out of their dilemma. It was again in midsummer during harvest time that the priest, supported by his young assistant, had called one of the usual meetings in the marketplace. The young man stepped forward and called out to the Jews, "Can anyone here reply to my arguments?" For a moment there reigned a deathly silence. Suddenly someone from the side moved forward. "Yes, I'll answer you," a stranger called, as he bravely advanced to the platform. All eyes were turned towards the speaker, and to the great delight and relief of the Jews present, it was none other than their good friend Wolfe the cobbler. Sure enough, his return was very timely. Here he was right on the scene, quite ready for a discussion with the priest and his assistant. Again, Wolfe showed the power of his oratory in fluent Polish, brushed aside all the arguments and proofs of the two missionaries. He simply closed their mouths. They had to admit they were defeated. The Jews were filled with joy. They again felt secure. Wolfe and his wife now remained in the village. He felt it wouldn't be safe to go away and leave his fellow Jews helpless under the existing circumstances. One day, towards the end of summer, Wolfe was sitting in the Beis Medrash, studying as usual, when suddenly in burst 3 armed policemen and arrested him. This caused a great stir among the people. Wolfe's wife wept bitterly and pleaded with the police to release her husband, but in vain. They claimed that his arrest had come about on the orders of higher authorities, and that Wolfe was to be taken before the bishop at Lukach. It was obvious who was at the bottom of it all. The priest and his assistant, feeling worsted in their arguments with Wolfe, had decided to take revenge on him, and at the same time rid themselves of his presence completely. They denounced him to the bishop, who found a way of getting him arrested. Wolfe was held under arrest at Lukach for a month, during which period he had to go before the bishop twice weekly and discuss with this high ecclesiastical authority the merits of Judaism and Christianity. It was imperative for the bishop that he should achieve a victory over the cobbler, but this he failed to do. Wolfe always had an answer ready for him, and refuted all his claims, his proofs, and his explanations. The bishop, seeing that he could not manage him, had him sent under armed escort to the Supreme Council of the Catholic Church, which was then in Kiev. At first, Wolfe had a friendly reception. He was allowed to stay in a private house in freedom. Once a fortnight he was called to a public assembly to hold a debate with one of the ecclesiastical chiefs. Thus 5 months passed. In none of these public debates was there anyone who could get the upper hand over Wolfe. He always came out the victor. The priests felt they were no match for him. They just couldn't cope with him. And so they resorted to the old method of libel. They accused him of poking fun at the Catholic Church and priests and of mocking their Christian faith. Wolfe was brought before the ecclesiastical court. Everything had been arranged beforehand. False witnesses were produced who confirmed Wolfe's guilt. The prosecutor would demand the maximum penalty, and the verdict was to be that Wolfe should be burned alive. The trial was held in public. It took place in the very center of Kiev. The rabbi of Kiev and the Jewish heads of community were compelled to attend the trial. The tragedy, which had greatly shaken the Jews of Kiev, and in fact all Jewish communities in Welland, was increased by the fact that Wolfe's wife was expecting a baby, their first child. Wolfe had been so happy about the forthcoming event, but the unfortunate man did not live to see his child, for his death al Kiddush Hashem took place some months before the baby was born. The Jewish community in Kiev begged Wolfe's widow to remain there, and promised they would look after her well and see to all her needs. But she did not wish to stay. She had decided to return to Lubavitch, where she was born and where she had her parents. So she took the first opportunity of leaving Kiev and returning to Lubavitch. Her father, a poor tailor, was already old and was himself dependent upon support from others. For this reason she was unable to stay with her parents and could find no home. She had no near relatives to help her. The heads of the Jewish community in Lubavitch, knowing of the great saintliness and martyrdom of her husband and the fact that she was pregnant, were eager to see that she should have everything she needed. But she refused all offers of assistance, saying she had learned from her husband how important it was that everyone should support himself by the work of his own hands. She was therefore determined to take up some occupation which she can carry on right up to the time when her baby would be born. And so she took employment as a domestic in a household in Lubavitch, and gave birth to her baby there. It was a boy, and she called him Wolfe after his father. There was much rejoicing on the occasion of the child's circumcision. All the good folk of Lubavitch came to participate in the celebration. For 3 years, Wolfe's widow reared her child, and all by her own earnings, persistently refusing help from anyone, either for herself or for her little son. It is possible that this proved too much for the poor widow. The fact is that she became ill and took to her bed, from which she never rose again. The 3-year-old Wolfe was now doubly orphaned. The local community now had to find means of caring for the child's welfare. Very quickly, someone was found to take in the little orphan. This was Tzvi Ari and his wife Leah Brina. You will recall that these good people were the heirs of Binyamin the mystic, who had left his house and garden to the couple, they, on their part, promising him that they would take orphans into their home and rear them, and keep an open house for all who required night's lodging. This was indeed a particularly good opportunity. Now the little orphan was friendless and homeless no longer, for was he not the son of the saintly Wolfe who was so bound up in friendship with Binyamin? The kind Tzvi Ari and his wife Leah Brina had by now children of their own, a boy and a girl. They had been able to comply with another part of Binyamin's will, to name the boy Binyamin and the girl after his wife Sarah. Binyamin and Sarah were both gifted children. The boy distinguished himself in his studies, and his sister Sarah excelled in her beauty of character and appearance. Although she herself was yet a child, she did all she could to help her mother in the care of the orphans who lived with them. As soon as the little orphan Wolfe was brought into their house, little Sarah took him under her wing, played with him, and was very friendly towards him, just like a sister. Before long, little Wolfe began to show that he too had a great aptitude for study, and that he loved it. Thus it was quite natural that the two boys, Binyamin and Wolfe, should become companions in their studies. They were both very suited to each other.